My beloved child, there is a difference between discovering that someone has a past and discovering that the past is still standing quietly inside their present, and what you are about to hear begins exactly there. Not with betrayal. Not with some dramatic scene. Not with a secret designed to hurt you. It begins with a truth that was difficult for the person you love to explain, because the simplest version of that truth sounds almost impossible to understand: your soulmate is already married. But don't skip, because those words are only the surface, and the real story underneath them is far more complicated than the label suggests. For a long time, you may have sensed that there was a missing chapter. You noticed the pauses when certain subjects came up. You felt the strange distance that appeared whenever conversations became serious. There were moments when warmth seemed completely genuine, yet something invisible kept pulling them backward. Perhaps you wondered whether you were imagining it. Perhaps you questioned why someone could seem emotionally close one moment and guarded the next. The answer was never as simple as a lack of feeling. They were carrying a reality they did not know how to place into words. And somewhere beneath all that hesitation was one question they kept asking themselves: if you knew everything, would you still see them the same way? That question became heavier each time your connection deepened. Because the closer they felt to you, the harder silence became. Here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Their marriage did not begin as the beautiful certainty people around them assumed it was. From the outside, everything appeared settled. Two people had made a commitment. Families recognized it. Life moved forward. Responsibilities formed. Routines became familiar. Anyone looking from a distance might have believed the story had already reached its conclusion. But relationships are rarely understood from photographs, labels, or appearances alone. Behind that familiar picture were two people slowly realizing that commitment and emotional connection are not always the same thing. There were conversations that became shorter. Dreams that began moving in separate directions. A growing awareness that neither person wanted to keep pretending everything felt exactly as it once had. And this is important. Nobody needed to become the villain for something to change. Sometimes two people can respect what they once shared while quietly recognizing that the relationship has become something different. Stay till the end, because this is where your place in the story becomes much clearer. You did not arrive as someone meant to destroy another relationship. You were not supposed to become an escape from unresolved responsibilities. In fact, that is precisely why the person you love kept holding back. They understood that feelings alone could not justify careless choices. They knew that if anything meaningful were ever going to exist between you, it could not be built on confusion. So instead of rushing toward you, they stepped inward. They began asking themselves questions they had avoided for far too long. What do I actually want? What part of my life am I maintaining because it is familiar? What responsibility do I have to everyone involved? And if my marriage has truly changed, can I face that reality honestly without making another person responsible for my decision? That last question changed everything. Because suddenly, you were no longer the reason they needed clarity. You became the mirror that revealed how desperately they needed clarity for themselves. There is something rare about that realization. Sometimes meeting someone does not immediately create a new relationship, sometimes it exposes the truth about an old one. Your presence showed them how much of themselves they had quietly placed on hold. The conversations with you felt different, not because you performed some impossible miracle, but because they felt seen in places they had stopped expressing. You remembered small things. You noticed changes in their voice. You understood meanings hidden beneath ordinary sentences. And every time that happened, another uncomfortable truth surfaced. They had been living emotionally half awake for longer than they wanted to admit. Yet something stopped them from simply telling you everything. It was not only embarrassment. It was not only uncertainty. It was respect. They knew that revealing their marriage would immediately change the way you interpreted every previous interaction. Suddenly every warm conversation might look suspicious. Every meaningful silence might appear calculated. Every connection you had felt could become surrounded by questions. They feared that the truth would erase everything genuine that had existed between you. So they waited for the perfect moment. And the perfect moment never came. Strange, isn't it? Sometimes the longer someone waits to explain something because they want to explain it correctly, the harder the explanation becomes. One day becomes another. A conversation gets postponed. A sentence almost begins, then disappears. There is something I need to tell you, becomes, maybe later. Meanwhile, you feel the hesitation without understanding its source. And eventually both people are carrying different versions of the same silence. Something important is waiting for you here, because the biggest revelation is not simply that your soulmate is married. It is what they decided after finally accepting that their life could no longer remain suspended between appearance and truth. They did not immediately run toward you. They did something more mature, and perhaps more surprising. They began dealing with their existing life first. Quietly. Carefully. Without making promises they were not yet free to keep. A serious conversation happened behind closed doors, and for once, the conversation was not about preserving appearances. It was about honesty. Both sides acknowledged things that had been left unspoken for a long time. There was no dramatic enemy sitting across the room. There were simply two adults looking at the reality of what their relationship had become. And during that conversation, your name almost surfaced. Almost. The person you love stopped themselves, because they realized something profound: you should not be used as evidence for why their marriage was struggling. Those struggles existed before your connection became important. They belonged to that marriage, and they needed to be addressed there. That distinction matters more than you might realize. Because someone who genuinely respects you will not make you carry responsibility for choices that belong to them. They will not say, "I changed everything because of you." They will say, "I finally became honest about what was already changing inside me." Feel the difference. One statement turns you into an excuse. The other takes responsibility. And slowly, that is exactly what this person began learning to do. But then came the moment nobody expected. Their spouse asked a simple question. Not an accusation. Not an argument. Just a question that made the entire room become strangely quiet. Is there someone who reminded you what it feels like to be yourself again? They did not answer immediately. Because suddenly the truth was standing much closer than before. Your face crossed their mind. Your conversations. Your patience. The moments when you never demanded explanations but somehow understood that something was unfinished inside them. And still, they hesitated. Then they gave an answer that revealed more than they intended. They said, "There is someone who made me realize I have been avoiding my own truth." Notice what they did not say. They did not claim you belonged to them. They did not promise some perfect future. They did not turn you into a fantasy. They simply admitted that knowing you had awakened an honesty they could no longer ignore. That was the turning point. Because once a truth is spoken aloud, even gently, it becomes difficult to return to pretending it does not exist. But the next thing that happened surprised even them. Their spouse was not shocked in the way they expected. Instead, there was a long silence followed by an admission of their own. They had noticed the distance too. They had been feeling it for longer than either person had acknowledged. They had also wondered whether both of them were maintaining something because they were afraid of disappointing other people. Suddenly the conversation was no longer about you. It became about two people finally removing the masks they had worn around each other. And perhaps that is the part nobody could have predicted. The marriage was not hiding one enormous secret. It was hiding years of small truths that neither person had known how to say. Dreams had changed. Priorities had shifted. Affection had transformed. Expectations from family and life had made honest conversations difficult. Neither person had deliberately planned for this outcome. They had simply kept moving forward because stopping to ask difficult questions felt harder. Until now. Don't skip this realization. The person you love began understanding that choosing a different future does not require disrespecting the past. They could appreciate what their marriage had once meant while admitting that its present reality needed to be faced. They could care about another human being without pretending the relationship still held the same shape. And most importantly, they could refuse to drag you into the middle until they had clarity. That is why their behavior around you may have seemed confusing. The distance was not always rejection. The silence was not always indifference. Sometimes it was restraint. They wanted to approach you only when their words could stand on something solid. Yet there was still one truth they had not told anyone. Not their spouse. Not their family. Not even you. They had written something. Not a dramatic declaration, but a private message they never sent. They wrote it late one evening after finally realizing how different their life might become. The first lines were simple: "I should have told you sooner. You deserved the complete truth before you ever had to wonder where you stood." Then they stopped. Deleted part of it. Rewrote it. Stared at the screen. Because what came next required them to admit something deeper than attraction. They wanted to tell you that meeting you had not created their problems, it had revealed how long they had been avoiding them. They wanted you to know that every step they were taking now needed to happen because it was right, not because they expected you to wait at the end of it. That distinction mattered enormously to them. They did not want to place a silent obligation on your heart. They wanted you to remain free to decide what you wanted once you knew the complete story. And there is an unexpected kind of love in that freedom. Real care does not say, "I changed my life, therefore you owe me yours." It says, "I chose honesty because honesty was necessary. Whatever you decide afterward belongs to you." But they never sent the message. Not yet. Something happened the following morning that made them stop. Someone close to them learned about the conversation. A family member who had always believed the marriage was completely secure suddenly realized that changes were being considered. Questions followed. Advice came from every direction. Some voices encouraged patience. Others wanted immediate answers. And somewhere inside that noise, the person you love understood that the next decision could not be made to satisfy everyone watching. For perhaps the first time in years, they needed to decide what integrity looked like when nobody else could decide for them. Then your name was mentioned. Not by them. By someone else. And the room went quiet again. That is where the real story begins to deepen, because the person who mentioned you knew far more about your connection than anyone realized. They had noticed something months earlier. Something subtle. Something neither you nor the person you love had ever openly discussed. And when they finally explained what they had seen, your soulmate stopped trying to defend the past and began thinking seriously about the future. What was noticed, why your name surfaced at exactly that moment, and what your soulmate quietly decided afterward changes the meaning of everything you have heard so far, because the marriage was only the first truth waiting to. The room did not become quiet because your name was forbidden, it became quiet because everyone suddenly realized your presence in this story had begun long before anyone was willing to acknowledge it. The family member who mentioned you had been watching something subtle unfold for months, something the person you loved believed they had hidden behind ordinary conversations, careful expressions, and perfectly reasonable explanations. Yet some changes are almost impossible to disguise. They had noticed how your soulmate became calmer whenever your name appeared. They had noticed how someone who once seemed resigned to simply moving through life had started speaking differently about the future. New ideas appeared. Old dreams returned. There was more thoughtfulness in their decisions, more courage in their questions, and strangely, more honesty about the things that were no longer working. But what surprised everyone was what this family member said next. I don't think this person caused the change. I think they reminded you that you were allowed to change. Those words landed differently. Your soulmate had prepared themselves for judgment, uncomfortable questions, perhaps even assumptions about what your connection meant, but they were not prepared to hear someone describe the situation with such clarity. Because that was exactly what they had been struggling to understand. You had not arrived with instructions. You had not demanded that they choose you. You had not asked them to rewrite their entire life. In many ways, you had simply existed near them as yourself, and somehow that was enough to reveal the parts of themselves they had stopped listening to. Stay till the end, because the truth that surfaced after this conversation was not about choosing between two people. It was about choosing between two ways of living. Continuing according to expectations, or finally becoming honest enough to accept that life had changed. And your soulmate knew they could no longer postpone that decision. They returned to the unsent message that evening, but this time they did not immediately begin typing. They reread every sentence slowly. I should have told you sooner. That line suddenly felt too small. How could a few words explain years of history? How could they tell you they were married without making you feel as though every meaningful moment between you had been built on missing information? How could they explain that their marriage had been emotionally changing long before you entered the picture? And perhaps the hardest question of all, how could they tell you what they felt without accidentally asking you to wait for them? So they placed the phone down. For several minutes they simply sat there, thinking about the first moment they realized you mattered differently. It was not some grand romantic scene. It was something almost forgettably ordinary. You had asked them a question nobody else had asked in a long time: what do you actually want? They remembered almost laughing when you said it because the question sounded so simple. But later, alone, it stayed with them. What did they actually want? Not what would make the family comfortable. Not what looked sensible from outside. Not what they had promised themselves years earlier when they were a different version of themselves. What did they want now? They could not answer. That frightened them more than the question itself. They realized they had become excellent at fulfilling roles while slowly losing contact with their own voice. Partner. Family member. Responsible adult. Reliable person. They knew how to be everything people expected, but somewhere along the way they had stopped asking whether the life beneath those roles still felt true. And then you arrived with one ordinary question that cracked open an extraordinary realization. Something important is waiting for you here. Your soulmate did not suddenly decide that you were the solution. They realized that no person should become the solution to another person's unfinished life. If they ever approached you honestly, they wanted to do so as someone who had already taken responsibility for their circumstances, not as someone asking you to rescue them from those circumstances. That decision changed what happened next. Instead of sending you the message, they requested another conversation with their spouse. This one was quieter than the first. There were fewer defenses. Fewer attempts to explain everything perfectly. They spoke about what both of them wanted their lives to become, independent of expectations. And slowly, a surprising possibility emerged. Perhaps they had both known the answer for longer than either wanted to admit. Their spouse had their own unspoken dreams, their own feelings about how the relationship had changed, their own reasons for remaining silent. Neither person wanted unnecessary conflict. Neither wanted to erase the good years they had shared. They simply needed permission to acknowledge that gratitude for a relationship's history does not automatically mean the relationship must remain unchanged forever. Then came a sentence your soulmate never expected to hear. Their spouse looked at them and said, "If we are going to decide anything, let's decide it because it is true for us, not because another person has appeared." Your soulmate immediately understood. You could not become the reason. You could only become part of whatever future might exist after the present had been handled honestly. That night, something inside them settled. Not completely, but enough for them to breathe differently. They understood that whatever happened next would require patience. There were practical conversations still ahead. Family feelings mattered. Shared responsibilities mattered. Respect mattered. Nothing meaningful could be solved through one emotional conversation. Yet for the first time, everyone directly involved was beginning to speak from reality instead of appearance. And that changed everything. But then another unexpected piece of the story surfaced. The family member who had mentioned you earlier asked your soulmate to speak privately. They walked away from everyone else and said something that immediately caught your soulmate off guard. "There's something you don't know about them." Your soulmate's expression changed. For 1 second, every fear they had been suppressing returned. Had you said something? Had somebody misunderstood your intentions? Had there been another conversation they knew nothing about? The family member noticed their reaction and quickly explained that it was not bad news. In fact, it was almost the opposite. Months earlier, they had encountered you indirectly through a conversation with someone else. Your name had come up, and what they heard stayed with them. You had apparently been given an opportunity to speak about your soulmate when they were not present. You could have revealed personal details. You could have exaggerated your closeness. You could have tried to make yourself appear more important in their life than you actually were. But you did none of those things. You protected their privacy. You spoke respectfully. You refused to turn private emotions into public entertainment. And without realizing it, you had made an impression on someone connected to their family. Your soulmate stared at them, almost unable to respond. Because while they had been worrying that their complicated situation might make you question their character, you had been demonstrating yours when nobody was watching. That changed something inside them. They remembered every time you had given them space instead of demanding explanations. Every time you could have pushed for answers but chose patience. Every moment when you seemed to sense there was more happening beneath the surface but did not force them to reveal something before they were ready. Suddenly they understood that your patience had never meant you were unaware. Perhaps you had noticed more than they thought. Perhaps you had simply decided that truth offered freely would mean more than truth extracted under pressure. Don't skip this part, because this is where your soulmate's greatest fear began changing shape. Until then, they had been afraid that telling you the truth would automatically mean losing you. But now they realized something else. Keeping you in uncertainty could be more damaging than giving you information and trusting you to make your own choice. Honesty might not guarantee the outcome they wanted, but silence guaranteed that you could never make a fully informed decision. And if they truly cared about you, they had to give you that freedom. They returned home and opened the message again. This time the words came differently. They deleted almost everything they had written before and started fresh. There is a part of my life I should have explained earlier. I am married. I know that sentence changes the way you may see everything between us, so I don't want to soften it or hide behind complicated explanations. But I also need you to know that I am dealing with my marriage directly and respectfully. I am not asking you to wait for me. I am not asking you to make a decision tonight. I only want you to have the truth I should have trusted you with sooner. They paused. Their finger hovered over the screen. Then they added something much more personal. Meeting you did not make me want to run away from my life. It made me realize I needed to stop running away from myself. They read that sentence again. Once. Twice. 3 times. Because it was the closest they had come to explaining what you meant. You were not an exit door. You were not an escape route. You were the unexpected person whose presence made them realize they could no longer live disconnected from their own truth. Yet even now, they did not press send. Because one final conversation needed to happen first. Their spouse had asked to speak again the following day, and your soulmate believed it would be wrong to send you a deeply emotional message while their marriage was still sitting inside an unresolved conversation. So they waited one more night. And that night felt strangely different. Not dramatic. Not frightening. Just quiet. They looked around at a life filled with memories, objects, routines, photographs, and years that could never simply disappear. They understood something deeply human. Moving forward did not require pretending those years meant nothing. Whatever happened, they wanted to leave every chapter with dignity. They wanted the future to begin without turning the past into an enemy. The following day arrived, and the conversation with their spouse began with something completely unexpected. Their spouse had been thinking too. They had spoken privately with someone they trusted. They had examined their own feelings without blaming anyone. And now they wanted to say something clearly. I don't think either of us should keep living inside a relationship simply because we are afraid of what everyone else will think. Your soulmate remained silent. Their spouse continued. But if we change this, we have to do it properly. No secrets. No pretending. No making somebody else responsible. Those words matched almost exactly what your soulmate had been thinking. For the first time, they were not standing on opposite sides of an argument. They were standing beside the same truth, looking at it from different directions. They agreed that whatever decisions followed would need time, honesty, and respect. There would be conversations with family. There would be practical matters to understand. There would be emotions neither could predict. Nothing needed to be rushed simply because clarity had finally arrived. But something fundamental had changed, neither person was pretending anymore. When your soulmate stepped away from that conversation, they reached for their phone. The unsent message was still there. They opened it. Their heart moved faster, not because they were about to promise you some impossible ending, but because they were finally about to stop allowing you to build your understanding on incomplete information. Their finger moved toward send. Then the phone rang. It was the same family member who had defended you earlier. Your soulmate answered, expecting another conversation about the marriage. Instead, the voice on the other end said, "Wait. There is one more thing you need to know before you contact them." Your soulmate froze for a second. What? There was a pause. Then came a revelation nobody had expected. Apparently, you had made a decision of your own. You had not announced it dramatically. You had not used it to pressure anyone. But something in your life had shifted because you had grown tired of living inside uncertainty. And suddenly your soulmate realized they were not the only person whose future had been changing quietly. While they had been struggling to become honest with themselves, you had been doing the same thing in your own way. The question was no longer simply whether they were ready to tell you the truth. The question was whether they had waited too long. Because what you decided, and what they discovered about the reason behind your decision, was about to completely change the conversation they had been preparing to have with you.